So sticking with conscious suffering just for a while, and if we were to think about it clearly, which we don't, if we were to think about it clearly, we'd obviously put conscious suffering quite high up on the list of things to learn, higher up than a lot of things that we teach at school, for example. We never teach conscious suffering at school, even though I'm not saying that you could actually teach it directly as a sort of curriculum or anything, but still, it could be addressed. So when we start off in life, we learn all sorts of things, and if we are brought up in the industrialised nation, we're trained heavily in how to live in a machine-like world and operate in a machine-type world, and do stuff that fits in with the environment that we've created for ourselves. So we're heavily trained. Some of the stuff we learn is practical. So we could learn cookery or something. But a lot of it is decided by the type of environment that we live in. And obviously that is necessary because we want to be able to be adapted to our environment and make a living within it. So that's not an inconsiderable matter, really. But even so, if any of us were to think or make a little thought exercise and think, well, if I could go back to when I was young and impressionable and starting out, what would have been a really great thing to learn? What would have been a useful thing to learn? And how to suffer, I would say, would definitely be a good thing. And we may not see that until we are suffering. And when we do find ourselves in the midst of suffering, and we have this choice, even though it's not a choice, but it's a possibility of two ways to go down: the type of suffering that makes suffering worse, or the type of suffering that doesn't make it worse and we actually grow as a result of. So one's kind of sterile suffering, pointless suffering, suffering without any meaning, and the other is still suffering, but there is meaning to it. And the fact that there's meaning to it makes a huge difference. Makes all the difference in the world. There is a quote about that, and I can't for the life of me remember it. But some psychotherapist said something like that. We can endure anything with meaning, if there's meaning. So we learn things at school, we learn lots of things. But really, if we were to be quite clear about it, we're learning stuff that's useful for the system that we're fitting into. The system requires people who can do this and do that, etc., etc. Now, it isn't the case, generally speaking, that we're learning stuff that would be good for us to learn for our sakes, not for society's sake or not for the system's sake. Because the system doesn't care if we suffer. Or, in actual fact, for the system to work, we have to be manipulable, and that means basically we have to be buying into ways of supposedly avoiding suffering or supposedly being happier, because that's what society runs on. That's what our consumer society runs on. And they're both the same thing, so ways of avoiding suffering and ways of having a pleasurable life. It's the same thing. And that's where our motivation is. So we could say that we want to learn how to... Well, what we could say is that society specialises in stuff like entertainment and things that we all want to do, spend our money on, whatever the hell it is. So we specialise in entertainment and pleasurable pursuits for the mind-created sense of self. So that's great for the mind-created sense of self, in as much as anything can be great for the mind-created sense of self, which ultimately it can't, because it's a fiction. No matter what it gets, it's still a fiction. No matter how much we bend over to facilitate the world so it would suit the mind-created sense of self, it's still not going to really benefit the mind-created sense of self, because there's nothing there to be benefited, really. It's just an idea that we have. So that's where our big emphasis goes. And where our emphasis doesn't go in is in teaching the art of suffering. And the art of suffering is a real thing. Because aside from all the bullshit, sooner or later, for most of us, we're going to come face to face with suffering, and we're going to realise if that suffering is anything more than just very transient and situational, we're going to realise that we're not equipped. We're fantastically not equipped for it. And that's the one thing we would want to be equipped for. I went to a talk once by a psychologist fella, and he was a psychologist, well respected, I think. Certainly he was well respected by all the professionals who kind of had invited him to the seminar to talk about pain management. He was a pain specialist. This is many years ago. And all it was is wall-to-wall tricks, and not even very good tricks. As anyone who's had chronic pain probably tell you, most of the stuff that could be done for us in pain clinics isn't that great. They can do a little bit, but they can't really deliver that much. And in a lot of cases we quickly learn that there's nothing more these boys can do, or girls can do for us. They're not really delivering. But of course this guy wasn't letting that on, and he was just coming out with all the wall-to-wall tricks, including that old favourite distraction techniques. People never tire of distraction techniques. And I think the reason he was able to talk about it in such a way as if he actually believed that what he was saying made any sense at all, because probably he's never suffered from, I would say, he didn't have the look of someone who actually had experience of unremitting pain for long periods of time. Because if he had been, one of the things you learn is that distraction is not your friend. It's kind of a false friend. If I'm able to distract myself from pain for a while, that feels good, obviously, feels very good. But I pay it back, because when I can't distract myself anymore, the pain comes back with a vengeance. Thus undoing any benefit that I might have thought I was obtaining. So really, I'm punishing myself, I'm setting myself up for a worse time in the future. But we don't have a focus on that. So what would be helpful would be to find a way of wholeheartedly engaging with the pain without recriminating against ourselves or recriminating against the pain, or without wishing things could be otherwise. Instead of looking for some temporary way of kidding ourselves that I'm not in this situation, or the pain isn't as bad as all that. So really, And I think we can take it that there are no cleverer tricks really to get rid of, help us with pain. It's just not the sort of thing that's very amenable to tricks. Tricks fall very flat very quickly, and you're left back in this world where all bullshit is exposed very quickly as bullshit. And yet it's an old thing, as I was saying a number of times, that this is old wisdom. Like, we've known it a long time. There's no reason for us to come along and cleverly reinvent it. And supposedly in a so-called scientific fashion, which really just makes it harder for us to point the finger and say, well, look, this is just rubbish. If some guy comes up and stands in front of a group of people and talks rubbish, maybe we could say that. We'd say, look, geezer, that's a load of baloney. But if they're all fancy and scientific, we're worried that we'll come across as being stupid, and we don't want to show ourselves up because they're scientific and they've got all this extra status as a result. So in the social sciences, and I'm not talking about science as a whole, but in the social sciences, the scientism was used to browbeat us into accepting rubbish, or bullshit really, which is a very unworthy thing to use science for. Science shouldn't be put to such scurrilous uses, such disreputable uses. No scientist worthy of the name would stoop to such antics. So a long, long time ago, people knew about conscious suffering, and in the Acts of John, which is part of the Apocryphal, there's a saying, and the saying is, if you had known how to suffer, you wouldn't have had to have suffered. Therefore, get it together and learn how to suffer. So that's an important thing for every single human being to know, really, isn't it? I mean, the Apocrypha, that's not part of the Gospels of the Bible. It was edited out. I don't know why that was edited out. It's a very vital piece of wisdom, really. But the point I'm making is that we've known all this a long, long time and we've forgotten it. Part of learning the art of suffering consciously is that it's a thing we do that's for us, and it's not about fitting into the world that we've created for ourselves, the collective. And I suspect this has got a lot to do with it, that anything that isn't about fitting into the collective, fitting into the world that we've created by agreement for ourselves, isn't really valuable. And in addition, if we aren't so easily browbeaten, and we're not so afraid of pain, and we're not so attracted to transient pleasures, we're not so easily manipulated, obviously. So we really should be under no illusions that although this collective system that we've created for ourselves is supposedly to help us, it most certainly isn't in these most essential of ways. It's only there to help us in a superficial way because it wants us to be able to operate within the terms which it itself has created. But in any deeper, more useful ways, it certainly doesn't want to help us, and it won't help us. So that's a little detour really, because that isn't even therapy or mental health, that's just life. And it's the question really of what would be useful to learn in life. And you might think, well, that's kind of pretty depressing just to think that life is about suffering, so we have to learn how to suffer because that's what life is. But in a way it's true that if we don't know how to suffer, we don't know how to live. And yet, of course, it makes perfect sense that we want to have the fun bits, and we want to learn about those, and we just want to pretend that the other nasty stuff doesn't exist and sweep it under the carpet. And that's all back to front, because it turns out the good stuff is the stuff we want to sweep under the carpet, and all the other stuff that we want to celebrate is kind of worthless, really. It's a momentary distraction. It's worthless in the sense that it does not in any way help us to grow. It just traps us in being who we're not. It traps us in this kind of world where we're existing as players within a game which we didn't design and which has no real meaning to us other than in the terms of the game itself. So going back to this thing about meaning, there can't possibly be any meaning in the mind-created virtual reality or in society or in the system of thought, because it's a game. It has nothing to do with who we really are, and it only has to do with who we're pretending to be. So of all the criticisms we could ever level at this way of life that we've invented for ourselves, to make the observation that it is lacking in any real meaning, it's got to be the most devastating. Okay, thanks for watching.